Yes, I am the footballer. The camera takes off about 20 pounds. But no, so we've heard about silos and the people across organisations. You shouldn't just stay in your team, you should work together, and that sounds nice. And you're probably sat there going, that sounds like a nice idea, but why is that important? Why is that a good idea? I understand how to do it, but why is that nice? Like, look at all of these lovely BBC websites. They're all maintained by different engineering teams, different product owners, and they seem to function totally fine. Like, BBC Sport exists, BBC News exists, everything's fine, right? Why do I need to go and talk to some developer in weather or something? And you, hypothetical accuser, would probably be right for quite a while until the arrival of this. Boom. Anvil transition effect, thank you, Keynote. This is a thing that happened a few months ago, is BBC Reef, which is a new font for the BBC estate. If you've been on BBC Sport in the last few weeks, you might have seen it. It's eerily similar to Helvetica, but it's definitely not. I've been told to say that, it's definitely not Helvetica. And basically this was a new font family for the BBC, so that we could have our own font face, so we could have a distinctive identity. You may be thinking, why did you commission this custom font face? Well, before Reef, across the BBC estate, we have 6 different font faces, all doing some different things, all occasionally doing the same thing. And it just creates sort of a very varied feel across the estate. So the idea was that we could stop paying license fees for all of these crazy amounts of fonts and just have one font to have a consistent experience. There is a whole bunch of design thought that went into this font about how it looks, how it works. I'm not here to talk about that. I'll link to some blogs at the end so that you can go and read about the wonderful design decisions they made. I'm here to talk about the engineering of it. How do we get that nice font that we've just made onto people's computers? Now, one way that this could have happened is, say, there was a writ sent out to all the BBC engineering teams, and they said, you have to put Reef on your websites now. So all the product owners of all the websites across the BBC go to their engineer and say, can you do me a font? And they go, so, you want a load of custom font? Said the engineers. And all of the engineers having portfolio websites or having built a website for their kids' theatre, play, society or something, all know how to put a custom font on a website. So they all rush off to their CSS files, they add in their font faces, their super cool font, they add it to the body, and boom, we're done. The engineer rides off into the sunset. That's the engineer. Leaving the product owner with it. We're done, I'll see you in the pub. No, unfortunately it is not quite that simple. Font faces and custom fonts of the web are one of those weirdly, deceptively simplistic things. Because there's a web standard for it, you think, this should just work. Not at all. So I'm going to talk you through a few of the pitfalls. I spent ages trying to figure out whether I should do that or not, and I don't think it was worth it. But there are a few pitfalls when implementing custom fonts. And I'm not just talking about a non-system font. If you want to put a non-system font on your website that exists somewhere else, honestly, just go use Typekit, go use Google Fonts, go use something that exists. It'll save you a lot of trouble, as we found out. I'm going to talk you through a few of these issues. Some of them are unique to the BBC and large-scale organisations. Some of them are more general that you can probably use in practice. The first one is caching. Ideally, you should cache this font. That's a good idea. Now, if all of our engineers have gone and done the solution I talked about earlier, where they all run off and just stick it in their static assets and then upload the CSS, the problem with that in the BBC is that each of these websites only exist on their subdomain after BBC. They only have, like, news only has access to bbc.co.uk/news, sport has access to /sport. So they all run off and they upload all of their static files to their websites. But that means they're all stored behind these subdomains, which means that your browser's not very clever. All it looks at when it comes to caching is it looks at the URI, is it the same? These are probably the same thing. It can't figure out that these WAF files are all actually identical, so it will cache them again and again and again. And just that results in a bad user experience. Like, take for example, perfectly normal day on a BBC website. You put up your web browser, your home page is bbc.co.uk, because why the hell not? And there's a new website, there's a new font even, and it downloads the font, and you've got it, that's fantastic. And you think, oh, I should check the news. You go to BBC News, and then it downloads it again. And you think, oh, I'm going out later today, I should check the weather, and then it downloads it again. And then you think, oh no, there's that match on later today, I know, I'll go check BBC Sport, and it downloads it again. And you now have 4 versions of this thing cached in your web browser from just moving between the BBC estate as any normal person would. Now, we spent a while trying to figure out how we should deal with this. Like, should we just host it under one product thing, then everyone links to it, and then that sort of creates an idea of dependence? And the end solution we came up with was to use this thing, which you may have noticed on BBC websites, this little bar across the top. This is pretty much the only piece of code that's shared between every single public-facing BBC website. It's a thing called Orbit. Visually, it's that nice little nav bar at the top that allows you to click on different things. But technically, it loads a bunch of JavaScript, it loads some tracking things, some require.js, some polyfills, things like that. And we thought this would be a good place to upload it, because we could upload the static files to their static file server, which is like navigation.bbc.co.uk or something like that, and then everyone else would link to it, because there's already a dependent relationship there, so we're not sort of creating new dependencies of a person having to look after another person that don't exist. So there we go, we've got a place to cache it now. It's in this one place of truth. Your browser's going to be cool, it's going to be fine. But the kind of issue with fonts is we kind of need to talk about how heavy they are. Because fonts aren't just one font. Like, if you want to have a wide variety of design ideas, or if you want to bold and all these different things, it's not just this one font file of like, hey, I have a sans font, I'll load that, here we go. If you want any other ones, you have to have also a light, a medium, a bold, and an extra bold. And all of those have their own WAF files as well. And if you ever want to put any emphasis on anything, you need italics as well. And say, hey, you know what, we want a better reading experience, we want to look a bit more, you know, like a traditional reading thing, so we need all of these serif variations as well. And suddenly, that's a lot more than just one font file. You suddenly have 20 font files at about 50 kilobytes each, which is a fair amount. And really, because we ship it in WAF and WAF2, so that's 40 font files at about 50 kilobytes each. When you add it all up, it's 2 megs of data. Now, you might not know off the cuff how much that is in comparison in the sort of web world, so if we compare that to the average size of a web page, an average size of a web page at the moment, this was from like November 15, I think, is about 3.4 megs. So if you're shipping 2 megs of fonts, you're shipping more than half the size of an average web page. And even more than most web pages often send images. So that's a lot of stuff to be downloaded. So how do you attempt to reduce this or attempt to deal with this well? First of all, one we've already kind of talked about, cache. You won't have to have a central cache for anything. You should have one anyway. But make sure you set the max age on your assets to at least a year, because fonts don't change. Like if they come to you in February, they should be able to come to you in November, and it should just work. The second one is use WAF or WAF2. They have built-in compression. You could ship an OTF or a TTF. Don't. But if you do, gzip them. And then the third one is only load what you need. If you have a web page which only has a sans on it, only load the sans. If you have a serif, only load the serif. Now the nice thing about this third one is your web browser does this for you. This kind of happens automatically. To show you a quick example, in this example we have some CSS at the top where we load in the font as our lovely font face, and then we have some HTML in the bottom. In this context, if your web browser hit this web page, it would not load that font file. Because web browsers are quite clever and they look through the DOM and they say, am I using this font file? I don't need it. It's okay. The only way you would actually get your browser to download it is if you added some sort of class, like cool font, you apply that to the body, then your browser's like, oh, great, font, and runs off and downloads it. And the nice thing about this is this works for weights and italics and sans and serifs. So if you only use a serif italic in the page, it'll only download a serif italic. And that's quite nice that the browser does all of this work for us. It's very friendly of them. But this is one side of the sort of issue with implementing web fonts, is you have the issue of weight, and then on the other side, we have our third pitfall, which is performance. And really when coming up with your custom font loading solution for whatever you're trying to do, is you're kind of balancing between these two things, between performance and weight. And what I mean by this is that if you just do what we've talked about, you implement this thing where you've got the app font face, you've got a static place, it's cache, and you load it into the page, you will run into the grand enemy of custom font people, which is flash of invisible text. Which is basically, you'll come to a web page, say for example the gel web page, www.bbc.co.uk/gel, and you would see this first of all. You'd be like, why is there just a child in the middle of nowhere? What a strange website for a license fee to pay for. And then eventually the checks would pop in and you're like, oh, I'm on an article page, this is totally cool. Now this phrase, flash of invisible text, is kind of, it's not quite true, because flash is an optimistic word. Flash implies that you're sitting on a website, on a laptop with a great fiber optic connection, you get the font immediately and you barely see it at all. But if you're on a phone in the middle of nowhere with some NAT 3G, you could be sitting on that invisible page for a fair amount of time. And that's not good enough. That's a bad user experience. This is a way that engineering is impacting on your end user experience. Now, the way we can sort of start to get around this, well, first of all, the reason why this happens is because font loading is blocking to rendering text. Now, I'm going to warn you, the next slide is incredibly approximate. I don't want any of you coming up to me saying, oh, that wasn't quite accurate. This is a very approximate timeline of page load. This is not exactly how the waterfall works, I know, but I didn't have too long and Keynote is quite hard. But essentially what happens is your browser loads the document first, loads the HTML, it looks at the HTML, it goes, hey, there's a style sheet, it goes and gets the style sheet, it sees a font in the style sheet, it goes and gets the font. Now, in this context, because we've already applied the font in the CSS class, your browser is like, oh, I need a font, I'll wait, and it won't render any of the text. Which means your first readable pane, which in this context means you can read the text on the page, is also your final pane. Which means you won't be able to see any text until it's perfect. Which, if you're a perfectionist, maybe that's okay for you. If you're only shipping websites for people on fiber optic connections, maybe that's fine. But the better way around this, which is the one that we ended up at, is doing something called flash of unstyled text with class, which is not about using just an untrendy text. It's often called FOUT with class, or FOUT with class. And basically, the way you do it is, instead of loading to a web page with some invisible text, there isn't actually any text there, it's just blank. But imagine there's some invisible text there. Instead of loading to that and then you wait for your font to come in and you get your nice lovely text, it would instead go to this blank text, it would go to some sort of system font first, and then it would go to a nice trendy cool font. The way you would do this is, by default, you would not have the custom font applied to your HTML. So you would not have the class, you would not have a bit of CSS saying, I'm going to make the HTML my super cool font. Instead, you set it to something like Arial or Helvetica, something that's loaded on the machine. Then you have a cool little piece of JavaScript that loads in the font you want, and then once the font is loaded, you pop it in. To show you a sort of example of this, one of the best ways to do this, or at least the way we did it, which I'm just going to assume is the best, I hope, is we use this lovely little library called Font Face Observer, which is a lovely little thing that deals with the going and getting the font, downloading the font, and knowing when it's loaded. And what we designed was this sort of API, so that people who look after a web page with your BBC News or BBC Sport, you can basically tell Orbit, kind of, what you need. So that top line, document class name index or cool font, is if you want the custom font loaded, you would add cool-font as a class to your HTML. And then this little bit of JavaScript would see that. It would go, oh, you want the cool font? Then it jumps in with Font Face Observer, loads in the font, and then once the font is loaded, it applies the cool font loaded class to your body. The CSS and HTML of that will look like this, where the HTML you have it set to Arial, and then when you add cool font loaded to your HTML, that's when you apply the custom font. So in this context, you can see in the HTML, it only has cool font. That's what it's like when you first get to the page. Then your JavaScript runs off, goes and grabs the custom font, and when it's got it, it then applies the cool font loaded. Now, we have the font loaded onto our page, and we can see it in all its glory. And this is doubly useful because it not only allows us to load the font in asynchronously, it allows us, the page, to request things from Orbit without having to do anything custom or weird. Because essentially we would ship the CSS and the JavaScript in that Orbit thing at the top of the page, that's that sort of central thing that they can't control, and then individual teams can say, I want to load the font, please. So we're not making them have to load it if they don't need it or anything like that. And what this does to our very approximate timeline of page load is it sort of brings the font load forward a little bit. Not quite that much, but like a little bit more. So you're loading the font asynchronously. And more importantly, because we're not saying the font is needed at first, you have your first readable pane much earlier. So it'll draw in the Arial or the Times New Roman or whatever system font you're using. And then also your final paint will be quicker as well, ideally in ideal conditions, but that's not always true. And this is kind of where we ended up as a sort of solution for the BBC specifically. Because this allows us that you don't have to load anything you don't need. People are opt-in, because the key thing with this rollout of this font is we're not doing it all at the same time. BBC Sport currently have it, the BBC Gel site has it, other people are looking at it. But the problem is Orbit is used by everyone all the time. So if we added a load of stuff that was forced to load, we would be adding page load to people's pages who don't want the font. And you don't want people adding things to your own page load because then all your tests will fail and you'll be like, why? And I'll be like, oh, it's you. But if you're implementing a font, the best thing that you can do, if you're working in a sort of small company where you only have one website, you know what you need, use all of the things that we couldn't use, please. Because we looked into all of these and we couldn't. Ideally, the best way of doing it, and this is the most weird mouthful of words in the world, is critical flash of faux text with data URI. Or critical FOUT. Or kafuft with the but apparently that's too far. But basically this is, instead of using a system font as your first draw, you would instead take your lovely little WAF file, you pull out all of the critical characters, so basically your A to Z and then the numbers, and leave everything else aside. Then you would binary encode that and stick that at the top of your HTML. So it comes down as you call the HTML, it's the first thing that's loaded, you already have your great experience, and then you asynchronously load in your other weights, your italics, your serif, whatever you need. And this is really, really quick and really, really cool. But we can't do that for a variety of reasons. As I described before, we're doing this as a slow rollout, which means that we don't know whether people want it or not yet. But also because we have a wonderful thing called the BBC World Service, which ships websites in just under 30 different languages. And if you want to stick a whole bunch of Latin characters at the top of the page that they don't need, it's not a great idea because there are many languages in the world that use Latin characters. We do have a Reef version of Cyrillic characters. So, you know, if you're in Russia, you don't need those Latin characters to be loaded, so why are you adding another 50 kilobytes to my page load? Also, if you're in Arabic, you don't need any of these things. And then in some places, you need both Latin and Cyrillic characters. That's a solution we haven't quite found yet. We're currently working on that, of trying to expand this idea of this API that you can be able to load what you want exactly, but that is an ongoing piece of work. So just to sort of sum up the web font part, if you are going to implement a web font, first of all, have a central source of truth on a cache. Use something like a CDN if you have one, or just stick it in your static files. Make sure you reduce the weight as much as possible, only load what you need. Use WAF or WAF2. Don't support anything older than that. It's not worth it. And then find your balance between weight and performance. If you don't mind having a flash of unstyled text there for a while, don't bother doing the critical FOF thing. Don't bother binary encoding it. It'll get to them eventually. Because also, all of this work about making this a wonderful lightweight experience, making it work really, really quickly, only happens the first time they visit your website. After that, it's in the cache and it's all done. So really, this is about optimizing for that very, very first page load, which was very important for us because we have people all across the world using little feature phones in the middle of nowhere and we want to get them to the data quick enough. And in that sense, use things that we couldn't use. We had very specific requirements. And in fact, we have many different requirements. Like BBC Sport have different browser requirements than BBC News do. They support iPlayer as well, they support different devices, different things. But we had to find a solution that worked for all of them. Now I know you're sitting there, you're going, this is all interesting about fonts, but where did the reuse thing go, and where did the culture thing go? This feels weird. And the interesting culture and the use part of this is the team that sort of put this work together. There was an idea to bring together a remarkable group of developers. We wish we were that cool, we're not. But the thing is all of this work wasn't done by one particular team in a different place, or even one developer. It was done by about sort of a dozen developers across 7 different teams, across 4 buildings, across 3 cities, all working together to find the best way of doing this. And for many of those developers, this wasn't on their roadmap. This wasn't in their backlog, this wasn't something that product owner was asking for. This was something that we as engineers went, we need to do this properly, because otherwise, that scenario which I talked about at the beginning, where the engineer just does it however they want, and there's different versions all across the BBC estate, that could have happened. And it would have been fine, but it wouldn't have been the best we could possibly do. And the reason, this team that we particularly had came together because we had a culture of cooperating across teams. We instigated that through a few different ways. One way was we have a meeting called Code Gel, which we have every month or so, and it's a way that developers across the business can come together and talk about issues that affect us all. We've talked about polyfilling across the page, the font, how we can do more reuse, how we use GitHub across the business, things like that. Things that aren't explicitly stated as like an objective from a product owner or something, but something that we as engineers say we need to do this better. And because that culture was already in place, when it came to implementing this font, I knew the Slack channel, it's ultimately just a Slack channel. I mean, it sounds like there was a wonderful group of people, we were the Avengers of coding. No, it was a Slack channel. But we knew the group of people to go and talk to. We knew the people who went, how does this work for news? How does this work for sport? How can we find a way of doing this together? So if you can build a culture like that, when you implement a font, hopefully, I mean, just use critical FOF with data URI is the ultimate thing. But yeah, I think that's ultimately kind of it. There are some useful links here, but they're not in any form that you can currently read. But I think I can send this out at some point. Yeah, if you all run up and just tap them with your finger, you'll be sucked into the internet and go there. These have a bunch of, Zach Leak's Comprehensive Guide to the Font Loading Strategies is all you need, really, for talking about fonts. And then that blog about the BBC Reef font and the design, there's some really cool ideas there. Also, I think there's like a BBC 4 documentary where David talks about the font flag a little bit. I don't think that's still available on iPlayer, but if it comes up again, watch like the final 5 minutes. Because our creative director is in there and he says some cool things. So that actually is the proper end, and we can now ride off into the sunset, leaving our people with their fonts. And yeah, thank you for listening. We've been Gel, those are our Twitter handles.